Samuel Sullivan had never planned on becoming a weapon. In fact, he had never even imagined a world where his abilities would be anything but a freak accident, something that might land him in a clinic with confused doctors murmuring about genetic anomalies. He was just a biologist, an academic, who had spent most of his life buried in textbooks and lab notes. He didn't ask for the gift, or the curse, that would soon make him the center of a global arms race. It started with a dull ache in his back. At first, it was nothing, just a pinch between the shoulder blades. But as days passed, the pain deepened, sharp and persistent, like an invisible knife cutting into him. The doctors couldn't explain it. It wasn't a muscle strain, not a slipped disc. Everything appeared normal on the X-rays. But the pain wouldn't go away. Then came the first miracle. One afternoon, he accidentally scraped his hand on a broken glass while cleaning up in his apartment. It was a minor injury, nothing serious. But to Samuel's surprise, the bleeding stopped in a matter of seconds. A strange tingling sensation spread across his hand, and when he looked down, the skin had already begun to knit itself back together. He blinked, confused, and touched the spot again, but the skin was smooth, like nothing had ever happened. At first, he thought it was some sort of fluke. But then the cut started getting worse. A deep gash on his leg from a bike accident healed in less than an hour. A sprained wrist felt fine in a few minutes, as if the ligaments had never been stretched in the first place. It wasn't just healing at an accelerated rate, his body was regenerating faster than any medical science could explain. The pain in his back, the one that had started it all, was gone too. Samuel felt invincible, but it was also terrifying when he confided in a few of his trusted colleagues at the university. They looked at him as if he were a subject for a research paper. One suggested that his body might have developed some sort of extraordinary regenerative capacity. Another talked about the potential of stem cells and gene therapy. But none of them understood what it meant, not really. Soon, Samuel realized that he wasn't just healing quickly, he could heal others too. At first, he thought it was a fluke again when he helped a student with a cut from an accident in the lab. But when the wound vanished in seconds, and the student's face lit up with disbelief and gratitude, Samuel knew that this was no coincidence. What he didn't know was that someone else was already watching. It wasn't long before the knock on his door came. Samuel was at his desk, reading up on the latest research in human biology, when a knock echoed through his apartment. He didn't expect anyone. His family lived in another state, and his colleagues usually called before dropping by. But the knock came again, more urgent this time. He opened the door to find two men in suits standing in the hallway. They were unremarkable in appearance, mid-30s, average height, average build, but their cold eyes and tense expressions made Samuel instinctively take a step back. "Mr. Sullivan?" one of the men asked, his voice low and deliberate. Samuel nodded. "Yes? We need to talk to you. It's about your condition." Samuel felt a chill spread through him. His heart skipped a beat. He tried to force a casual smile. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man didn't smile. "We know about your ability to heal. We're offering you a partnership. A collaboration, if you will. It could be very beneficial to you." Samuel felt his throat tighten. He hadn't told anyone. Not his family, not his friends. How did they know? Before he could respond, the second man stepped forward. "We represent a government project," he said, his voice sharper, more forceful. "We can offer you resources, protection, and we can make sure your talents are put to good use. But we need your cooperation." Samuel's mind raced. This couldn't be real. He had to be imagining it. "I don't think about it, Mr. Sullivan," the first man interrupted, his gaze turning calculating. "You're sitting on the most valuable biological discovery in the world. Healing at the rate you do? This could change the course of medicine, of warfare. You can't hide from us, and you don't want to. It's better for everyone if you join us." Samuel swallowed hard. He felt trapped, like a deer in headlights, unable to make a decision. Something about this felt wrong, like the men weren't really offering him a chance to help but using him for something far darker. But what choice did he have? They knew too much. Before he could speak, the second man spoke again. "We'll give you some time to think it over. But know this, you'll either cooperate with us, or we'll take you by force. Your ability is far too valuable to let slip through our fingers." Samuel stood there, paralyzed, watching as they turned and walked away without another word. His mind was whirling. What had just happened? He needed to think. But his thoughts were interrupted by a soft buzzing in his pocket. His phone. He pulled it out, only to see an unknown number flashing on the screen. Before he could answer, a message popped up: "They're coming for you. Don't trust anyone." The message didn't make sense. It was a warning. But who was it from? Samuel's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to think of anyone who might have sent it. But his thoughts were too scattered. The room felt suddenly smaller, the walls closing in. He had to get out. He had to leave, fast. He grabbed his bag, tossed a few essentials inside, and ran to the door. But before he could even touch the handle, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hall. He turned and ran toward the back window, throwing it open with a burst of panic. The ground was far below, but he didn't hesitate. Without thinking about the consequences, he climbed out, scrambling to find a handhold as he descended the building side. He wasn't going to be a part of whatever this was, but he wasn't fast enough. The moment his feet hit the ground, he felt a sharp pain in his side. He gasped for air as something cold and metallic pressed into his skin. "Going somewhere?" a voice sneered. Samuel didn't remember much of the following hours. There was darkness, pain, and a disorienting sense of movement. He was drugged, no doubt about it. But by the time he regained full consciousness, he found himself strapped to a table in a sterile, clinical room. Machines beeped around him. His hands were immobilized. And standing over him was a man he recognized, Colonel Marcus Stroud, the same figure from his brief encounter in the hallway. Stroud's face was cold, clinical. He was the man behind the government project. The man who was going to turn him into a weapon. Samuel's stomach churned as he tried to move. But his body wouldn't cooperate. They had done something to him, something irreversible. "Welcome, Mr. Sullivan," Stroud said with a slight smirk, as if this were all part of some grand plan. "You'll make a fine soldier. We're going to make sure of that." Samuel stared at the man, his heart pounding. There was no turning back now. But somewhere, deep inside him, a spark of defiance began to smolder. He had no idea what they were going to do to him, but he knew one thing: they had made a terrible mistake. Samuel could feel the cold metal of the operating table against his back, the weight of his restraints like a vice around his limbs. The sterile, clinical smell of the room made his stomach turn. His body felt weak, disoriented, but his mind was racing, already calculating, searching for any way out. Colonel Stroud stood in front of him, arms crossed, watching him with a gleam in his eye. There was a twisted satisfaction in his expression, as though Samuel's predicament were somehow part of a carefully orchestrated plan. Stroud's voice was cold, almost businesslike. "You're the key, Mr. Sullivan. You've been a puzzle to us for so long. Your body, it's perfect. But the next step is crucial. You're going to help us change the battlefield forever." Samuel didn't respond. His muscles screamed in protest as he tried to push against the restraints, but it was futile. The drug still lingered in his system, dulling his senses. He didn't know how long he'd been out, but it had been long enough for them to strap him to this damn table. And if Stroud was to be believed, they were going to turn him into a weapon. Not just any weapon, a living, breathing tool of destruction. "You think you have a choice in this?" Stroud said, his voice tinged with mockery. "Your power isn't just a gift. It's an asset. And we'll extract every drop of potential from it." Samuel's mind raced. Escape was his only option, but how? His healing abilities were the key, they were the reason they'd gone to such lengths to trap him. If he could somehow use them against them, maybe he could turn the tables, but how? They had him immobilized. His body felt heavy, sluggish, as if they were controlling it. And the drugs, they were working, more powerfully than he could have ever anticipated. He tried to focus, tried to summon his healing ability, but it felt like a distant echo, something he couldn't fully reach. "I bet you're wondering why we're doing this," Stroud continued, oblivious to Samuel's thoughts. He paced around the room, stopping in front of a monitor that flickered with data. "The world is changing, Mr. Sullivan. Traditional warfare is a thing of the past. Now, it's about biological superiority. And your ability to heal, it's not just about patching up a soldier. It's about making them invincible. You heal them, they fight again. That's the future. And you're going to help us make it real." Samuel clenched his fists against the restraints, his teeth gritted. His mind was foggy, but the fire inside him was growing, pushing against the walls of his body like an untamed animal trying to break free. Stroud continued, not noticing Samuel's internal struggle. "We've already tested your abilities. We've seen what you can do. What we need now is to harness them, refine them. You've seen what happens when soldiers die on the battlefield, they stay down. That's the problem. If we can make them heal, they get back up. They fight again. They win." Samuel wanted to scream at him. They were treating him like a tool, a piece of equipment. The thought of his body being used for their sick agenda made his stomach churn. This wasn't just about healing, it was about controlling life itself. The door to the room slid open with a soft hiss, interrupting Stroud's monologue. Two armed guards stepped inside, their faces cold and impassive. One of them held a syringe in his gloved hand. Stroud nodded to them. "Prepare him for the procedure." The guard approached Samuel, the needle gleaming in the harsh light. He could feel the cold tip of the syringe pressing against his skin, the sharp pinch of the needle as it slid into his neck. Samuel's muscles involuntarily tensed, but the drugs were already coursing through his bloodstream, pushing him deeper into a fog. The room spun, and Samuel's vision blurred as the world around him melted away. But even in the haze, he could still hear Stroud's voice, faint but persistent, echoing in his mind, "We're going to make you better, Mr. Sullivan. You'll thank us when this is over." No. He wouldn't thank them. He couldn't. His body went numb, and he lost all sense of time. For what felt like an eternity, there was only the sensation of being somewhere between consciousness and unconsciousness, trapped in a half-awake state. But in that state, something else started to stir. It was his healing ability. At first, it was a distant hum, barely perceptible. But the more they drugged him, the more they tried to manipulate him, the more his body fought back. His healing powers were never meant to be controlled, not like this. They'd turned his strength into a weakness, and now it was pushing back against them. Stroud was wrong. Samuel wasn't going to heal them. He was going to heal himself. The first thing Samuel felt when he came to was the sharp taste of blood in his mouth. His eyes snapped open, and the blinding white light of the lab stung his retinas. His limbs were still restrained, but the fog in his head had started to clear, and with it, his sense of clarity. He could feel his body aching, but it wasn't the dull, heavy ache of before. It was a strange sensation, like his body had been stretched thin, like something had been ripped away from him and was now trying to piece itself back together. He flexed his fingers, the restraint straining against his movements, but he could feel it, the power, the raw energy of his healing abilities, coursing through him. It was alive, like a current running beneath his skin. Samuel's heart thundered in his chest as he concentrated. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed against the restraints. The straps that had once held him tightly in place now felt like little more than paper, unable to withstand the force of his healing powers. With a sharp tug, they snapped. His muscles strained with the effort, but it didn't matter. His body was healing itself even as he fought. His bones, his muscles, they were all working to support him. to fight for him. Samuel could feel the power within him. It was no longer something to be afraid of, it was something to wield. He sat up, the room spinning as he adjusted to the movement. The guards were still standing at attention, their eyes wide with shock. The one who had injected him earlier was the first to react. His hand went for the gun at his side. Samuel's hand shot out in a blur, and before the guard could react, his wrist was twisted, the gun falling from his grip. The second guard lunged toward him, but Samuel's body was already healing at a rate that made his opponent's movements seem sluggish. He kicked out, sending the guard crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the machines. Samuel could hear his own breathing, ragged and strained, as his body continued to rebuild itself. He was stronger than he had ever been, stronger than they had ever anticipated. And for the first time since his capture, he felt the tide of power shift in his favor. Stroud was watching from across the room, his expression no longer filled with arrogance, but with genuine surprise. "How is this possible?" he muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing as he assessed Samuel's newfound strength. Samuel didn't give him a chance to process. He surged forward, grabbing Stroud by the collar and slamming him against the wall. "You think you can control me?" he growled, his voice low and menacing. Stroud's eyes were wide with fear, but he didn't back down. "You'll never escape, Sullivan. You're part of this now. You can't outrun what you've become." Samuel's hand tightened around Stroud's throat. He could feel the man's pulse racing, the fear emanating from him. But Stroud was wrong. Samuel wasn't part of this, he was going to destroy it. "You're wrong," Samuel said through gritted teeth. "You're the one who's going to learn what happens when you play with fire." And with that, Samuel threw Stroud across the room, sending him crashing to the floor. The man struggled to get up, but he was no match for Samuel now. Samuel didn't wait for Stroud to recover. He turned and sprinted for the door, his body moving with a speed he had never known before. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get out. The facility was vast, the hallways empty, but there was a strange sense of urgency pushing him forward. He couldn't afford to look back. Not now. As he rounded a corner, he spotted an emergency exit. He didn't hesitate. He shoved the door open, his mind focused only on escape, but as the door slammed behind him, he heard the distant sound of alarms blaring to life. His time was running out. But Samuel had never been one to back down from a fight. He wasn't just escaping, he was coming for them. Samuel's heart raced as he tore through the halls, the blaring alarms echoing in every direction. His thoughts were a blur of adrenaline, his body pushing itself beyond its limits, each footstep a blur of speed, each breath ragged but steady. The pain in his body from the previous injections and procedures was already fading, his healing ability kicking in to replenish him faster than it ever had before. He felt invincible, but that feeling was brief, soon replaced with the sharp awareness that time was running out. They would come for him. They had to. He turned another corner, his senses hyper-alert, scanning every shadow, every sound. His mind was already calculating the best escape route, but he couldn't waste time on anything too intricate. The moment they realized what had happened, they would lock down the entire facility. If he didn't get out now, he might never get another chance. The emergency exit he'd found wasn't far, just another hallway away. He'd reached it before, but now the place felt like a maze. Every door he passed seemed to open into a sterile, identical corridor. He didn't know where he was anymore, but all he could do was keep moving. The walls were closing in, not just physically, but mentally. Stroud's voice echoed in his head, taunting him, "You're part of this now." No. He wasn't part of anything they had planned. He'd never signed up for this war they were waging in his body. This fight was his own, and it would end with them on the ground. As he sprinted forward, he heard the sound of boots behind him, echoing through the metal hallways. It was the guards, and they were catching up. His chest burned, his body was screaming at him, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. At the end of the hall, the exit door loomed, just as he had remembered it. He threw his shoulder into it with all his force, sending it flying open with a crash. He didn't hesitate, leaping into the narrow stairwell beyond. His footsteps echoed as he descended, the urgency in his every movement now matched by the growing sound of pursuit. He had no idea what was beyond the door, but it didn't matter. He was so close. The sound of shouting guards reached his ears. They were gaining, and Samuel didn't have much of a head start. He pushed himself harder, faster, willing his body to heal quicker, his muscles to cooperate. His mind raced through every possible scenario. What if they were waiting for him outside? What if there were more guards? He didn't know, but the cold, sharp reality was beginning to set in. He couldn't keep running forever. He burst through another set of heavy metal doors, finding himself outside, blinking against the harsh light. The daylight hit him like a slap, bright and overwhelming. For a moment, he stood frozen in the doorway, taking in the scene in front of him. A vast expanse of gray concrete and steel surrounded him, industrial buildings stretching far into the horizon. It was an isolated, heavily secured complex, miles away from any urban center, the perfect place for the kind of research they were conducting. There was no time to think. He heard the shrill sound of approaching sirens, the distinct hum of helicopters in the distance. He knew what that meant: backup. They were coming for him in every direction, and if they got their hands on him now, he might not get another chance to escape. Without wasting another second, Samuel darted toward the far side of the complex. The chain-link fences that lined the perimeter were reinforced with razor wire, and beyond that, a small parking lot sat empty, no guards, no vehicles. But there was a hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find something to use. His mind was already searching for a way out. As he neared the far corner, he saw a dark SUV parked by the side of the lot, seemingly abandoned. He didn't care how it got there or whether it was meant to be there. He saw it, and he knew it was his only shot. He pushed himself harder, willing his legs to carry him. His body was screaming for a break, but there was no time for weakness. There was no time for anything except getting out. He reached the car, and his hand found the door handle almost instinctively. The door was locked, but it didn't matter. Samuel's healing abilities weren't just about fixing cuts and bruises, they were about overcoming physical limitations. He could feel the metal under his fingers, like it was a living thing, responding to his touch. He focused, allowing his powers to flow through his hand, and in a flash, the lock gave way with a quiet click. The door swung open. Inside, the car was empty, but it didn't matter. It was a way out. He jumped in, slammed the door behind him, and immediately started the engine. The SUV roared to life. Samuel's hands gripped the steering wheel as he slammed his foot onto the gas. Tires squealed against the asphalt as he sped away, the sound of helicopter blades growing louder in the distance. He didn't look back. The road ahead stretched out before him like an endless, winding path. He didn't know where it led, and frankly, he didn't care. All that mattered was putting as much distance between him and the facility as possible. But even as he sped down the highway, his thoughts remained with the people who had orchestrated his abduction: Stroud, the men who had experimented on him, the forces that wanted to turn him into their puppet. He couldn't let them win. The only way forward was to fight back. It was late afternoon by the time he finally found a place to stop. A small, nondescript diner on the edge of a sleepy town, with a neon sign flickering above the door. The SUV was parked behind a row of trucks, hidden for now. Samuel wasn't foolish enough to think he was safe, not yet, at least. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself a moment of respite. He stepped out of the car, his legs unsteady, his body still healing from the aftereffects of the drugs and the mental strain of the past few hours. Inside, the diner was dimly lit and smelled faintly of coffee and grease. A few patrons sat at the counter, their conversations hushed and casual. The waitress behind the counter didn't look up as he walked in, but Samuel was used to that. He had no intention of drawing attention. He took a seat in the far corner, his back to the wall, and ordered a cup of coffee. As he waited, his mind wandered, but there was no peace. His thoughts kept circling back to the moment he'd been taken, the realization that his abilities had turned him into something more than human, a weapon. He'd never wanted this. He had been thrust into it, not by his choice, but by the greed of those who saw him as little more than a tool, and now, he had a choice. He could hide. Or he could fight. The coffee arrived in front of him, but Samuel didn't touch it. His gaze flickered to the window, to the sky above. He wasn't sure what would come next, but one thing was certain: the fight had just begun. The night was dark when he finally left the diner, his decision made. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but he wasn't going back to the lab. He wouldn't be anyone's weapon. Not now, not ever. He walked back to the SUV, his mind sharpening with each step. The facility would be looking for him, and Stroud would want answers. But Samuel wasn't just running away. He was going to make them regret ever thinking they could control him. With a determined breath, he climbed into the car and drove into the night, the road ahead uncertain but filled with the promise of revenge.